I'm going to kick off today's discussion and answer any questions you all may have in the chat. And my colleague and community director of Altimetric Collider, Jacob Smith, will also be here hanging out with us. My name is Ryan Robinson. Jacob and I work for a digital transformation company called Altimetric, who help our clients stay ahead of the curve, and they help everybody. They stay ahead of everybody in tech and innovation. Today, we are excited to showcase one of our very own Altimetric engineers, Jawad El Turk, who will be exploring how consumer driven contracts make it way more efficient to make changes to APIs. And I can't wait to actually grasp what this concept is even about. So I'm going to leave it to our expert, Jawad, to help us out.
First of all, thank you, Ryan, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. And I hope this will be a fruitful event today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jawad El Turk. I'm a software engineer currently working on the AV task project at Ford. I'm a backend software engineer, so I currently work with technologies like AWS, and currently we're moving to GCP. If you're part of Ford, I'm not sure if your team will be adopting this new technology anytime soon. But what I'll be talking about today is part of Spring Boot. So if you're working with Spring Boot, this is going to be very useful to you, especially if you work on APIs. So if you deliver APIs or you consume APIs. So our topic today is consumer-driven development. This helps cross-functional teams agree on like a contract between them to generate an API. Now, I'm pretty sure most of you here have either consumed an API before or wrote an API, and sometimes it's really difficult to have an agreement between teams on what the API should look like, what data you will be returning, things like headers and other stuff. So this is basically a solution for all of us, and it's called Pact. So what is Pact? Pact is code-first tool for testing HTTP and message integrations using contract tests, which means the consumer, like whoever is consuming the API, and the provider will agree on the form of the API, and this will be written in a contract, of course, using code. Contract tests asserts that inter-application messages confirm to a shared understanding that is documented in a contract, like I mentioned. And without contract testing, the only way to ensure that applications will work correctly together is by using expensive and brittle, sorry about this, integration tests. So like Postman, I'm pretty sure some of you wrote Postman tests for integration. So this will make you get rid of all these Postman tests, which are like third party software. This will actually let you write code in Java similar to JUnit. So what we will be working on today is very similar to JUnit, things you're already familiar with. And if you're a Spring developer, you should also be familiar with the annotations I will be using. Today, we will be using JUnit 5. So those of you who haven't worked on JUnit 5 yet, it's not a big deal. Most of the code I use is very similar to JUnit 4. The only difference between JUnit 5 and 4 when it comes to Pact is the annotations. So you can take a look at the documentation. I will provide a link by the end of this session, and feel free to test with it and explore. Next slide, please, Ryan. Okay. Okay, so this is the next slide. So what is contract testing? Contract testing is a technique for testing an integration point by checking each application in isolation to ensure that messages it sends or receives confirm to a shared understanding that is documented in a contract. So like I said before, here it's called consumer-driven development for a reason, which means the consumer of the API will be the one responsible for generating the contract, and the provider will basically run their controller, in this case, because we're working with Spring Boot today, to verify that the result they're returning is in line with whatever the contract is saying. For applications that communicates via HTTP, these messages will be the HTTP request and response. And for application that use queues, this would be the message that goes on the queue. So Pact is very versatile. Consumer-driven development technique. So you don't really only have, it doesn't only work with Spring, it can work with, I personally use it with AWS. It can work with queues like this slide mentions. So in practice, a common way of implementing contract tests and the way Pact does it is to check that all the calls to your test doubles return the same result as a call to the real application would. Next slide, please. So I haven't really tested with Azure, but Pact supports different programming languages. I know Azure is on, I believe, .NET. So I'm gonna leave this to you because as I said, I'll be leaving the documentation. But I believe it does support this, and we can discuss about this later. Okay, so contract testing is immediately applicable anywhere where you have two services that needs to communicate, such as an API client and a web front end, like I mentioned before. Although a single client and a single service is a common use case, contract testing really shines in an environment with many services, as is common for microservice architecture. Having well-formed contract tests make it easy for developers to avoid version hell. Contract testing is the killer app for microservice development and deployment. Can you move to the next slide, please? All right. Okay, so terminologies here. In general, a contract is between a consumer, for example, a client that wants to receive some data, and a provider, for example, an API on a server that provides the data to the client needs. And here it can be any two applications. It can be a back end and front end. Today, we will be focusing on just Spring Boot again. So you will see both the consumer and provider written in Java and Spring Boot. In microservice architecture, the traditional terms client and server are not always appropriate. For example, when communication is achieved through message queues for this reason, we stick to consumer and provider in this documentation. And I believe this is the last slide for this presentation. I just wanted to define what is Pact in general and who is the consumer and who is the provider. So now we can move to the hands-on demo. Okay. So first of all, sorry about that, close this, we don't need it. So this is first of all the Pact website. Can you guys all see my screen?
Looks good.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. So this is the Pact website. As I said before, it does support multiple programming languages. I personally only I'm only experienced with JVM or Spring Boot. But it does support .NET and other famous programming languages like Python, C++, and others. So maybe during the time I'm explaining this, you can go on the website and see if, or just Google search it if they support it. But let's move to our presentation now. So I believe you guys are already familiar with Spring Boot. I'm going to be uploading this project by the end of this session to GitHub, and I will send the link to Ryan, and she can forward it to everyone who is attending this session in case you guys want to test with it. So first of all, to begin with, we said there is a consumer and a provider. Consumer basically is the one who's responsible for generating the contract, as I said before. And the contract will basically have things like the method of your API, like whether it's a post, get, update, delete. Also, your API might have headers. It might have a body. It might have a query parameter and many other stuff. If you're a backend engineer, you should be familiar with these things already. So to begin with, I'm using here JUnit 5. So first thing you want to do is just writing a new client Pact test. So I can start this. So I'm going to start by client, or I'm going to name this. Okay, so first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna start by extending our class with Pact JUnit. Pact consumer. Okay, dot class. Okay, so that's the first thing. This will basically tell Pact to run your test using their extension, which will basically generate your contract and will generate, just generate your contract and also run the test. You as a consumer, you can also verify that your contract is built correctly, and we can go over this later. Another thing I want to add is basically, so what I'm about to type now, which is the Pact folder. This defines basically where you want your contract to be stored. By default, it's either, I'm going to go back to this slide because I added some notes here. So by default, okay, I think I erased them. By default, it's either under Pacts. So here I define it actually Pacts, so I changed the directory. It's either, let me go back to it. Okay, either under target pacts or build pacts in case you are using Gradle. So here I want to actually put it in a folder called Pact in my main directory. So I did that. So you can see here it generated Pacts, and I'm going to run this later. I'm going to stay in this class just because it has the notes, and I'm going to be, what you basically want to focus on is how to generate your contract, and then this is the test, which is annotated with test, to actually verify that your contract has what you are expecting. So one more thing, here you can set your provider. Provider can either go on the class level or on the Pact level. So here you can set any other provider you want. Since I only have one provider here, I set it on the Pact level, the class level. And it should be good for generating all the pacts within this class. Here you can also, so that's basically it for the annotation you will add to your class when you start. If you go to the documentation of Pact on their website, you might find things written in a different way. There's multiple ways to implement Pact. You can either extend a class or do it the way I do it. I find this way easier for me because I have, I can control things better this way. So next, here we are gonna just generate our Pact. So generating a Pact starts by annotating our method with @Pact and adding the consumer name. So here my provider will be Altimetric. Let's say you have team that provides the provides the API is Altimetric, and the team that consumes the API is Ford. So it's going to be Altimetric up here and Ford down here. So what does Ford need from Altimetric? They will come and say, so keep in mind this name here. It is important because you're gonna be using it in your Pact test for. So this is basically referencing the method you want to call from your contract after you generate it. to fetch the data from the contract and then verify against it. So one thing you need here is the builder or the Pact DSL with provider. This is basically responsible for generating your contract. First of all, let me show you what the contract will look like after we generate it. And this happens just by running the test. So this how it looks like basically. It's a JSON format. You have the provider name, you have the consumer, and you have all the interactions. Interaction includes the request and the response. And in case there is any rules that you set, let's say you want a VIN that takes a regular expression. So you can also define this in your test. And yeah, so it's pretty straightforward. So going back to my test here, first thing you wanna take care of is basically the state. Why is the state important? Because think of this basically as an endpoint that you have in your controller. So one endpoint will basically return an object, a JSON object with data, right? So in case everything you receive is good, like let's say your headers are there, if you have a body that is correct is there, so you're going to return a response entity with a success 200 status code. So this is how I define this state of my controller or endpoint. So I say, let's say, and you have an endpoint called add user or fetch users or whatever. And in this case, it's returning success response. So I add this. And here it's just giving details for your Pact response. And here you define the path. So the path basically is what your controller also responds to when you hit the API. So you guys are pretty familiar with this. Here the method, you define the method, which is either a post or get or update, as I said before. And if your endpoint requires headers, you can define these headers. I just basically wrote a hash map up here. And I defined my content type, which is application JSON. After this, if you have a body, in case of a post, most of the times you will have a body. So here it's a string format. So I just used JSON to map my dummy payload here into a string format. So this is pretty much it for defining the endpoint you want. Of course, there's many things that comes with it. Let's, for example, see what else we can find. Path query, for example, like I said before, if you have a query, yeah, and this is pretty much it. So after this, so here, this will define your endpoint, and this will define what is the expected result you want from this endpoint. So if you have an endpoint that lists users, for example, you're expecting the response. So here, after you define your endpoint, you will say, what do you want the response to be like? So you will say it will respond with, you want it to respond with status code 200, and you want the body to have something similar to this. So here I'm actually defining these hard-coded values because I'm gonna just show you my controller for a second here. So I have send user auth here. For example, I actually forgot to rename this. It should be get user or add user here. So I'm asking it to return a response entity success, and my response entity success looks like this. It has a response object, which has status code 200, a message success, and it has the HTTP status OK, which is, we hover over it, it's 200 here. So Yeah, so this endpoint here in my controller is just returning a success. So pretty simple. So that's what this test will look like. So I'm going through this just now. You guys have a general idea of what we are going to do, and then we will work on generating a pact and a provider test to verify against the contract. So that's it basically. Then after, so the body can have many forms. You can either define these this way. You can have, if you, let's say you have a list of object, you can put a minimum array like. Um, Here you will define the name of the array. So like, let's say we have data, the size of it, and so the array will have an object that might have, let's see here, string type. So you will have a name, for example, for your object. You might have another string type with last name here in your list. Then you can close your object and then close your array. But we don't need these. So I'm going to remove them for now because this test is working. We can verify this later. Since we closed the array, it's different now. Okay, so I'm going to remove these again. We don't need them. So that's basically it for generating the contract. And you will see that things reflecting in this. I'm going to delete these contracts. You should see them. And when we add something, you should also see it here. So one thing I want to talk about here is this property here in your Gradle. This will basically allow you to overwrite whatever is in your contract. So let's say you come and your team needs a new endpoint. So you want to update your contract. This will basically allow you to overwrite whatever is in this contract and instead of just appending to it. Because if you have like certain endpoints that are changing, you don't want the old code in here. So this gives you the permission to overwrite whatever is in your contract. So going back, I'm going to just delete this. Okay, so the next thing here, this is basically test, only a test to do what? To verify if whatever is in my contract is actually working as I'm expecting. So what I have here, this is basically a mock server. The mock server can be injected directly into my test method. It comes as part of Pact consumer. Another way to test this is basically using mock server or sorry, mock provider rule. This is part of JUnit 4. Since we are using JUnit 5, they provide us with this way or method to fetch my endpoint. And here I'm actually using UniRest. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, but some of you might be. Here you don't really have to use UniRest. You can use mock provider rule or any HTTP client basically to fetch this. This is probably the easiest way to do it. And as you can see, guys, now this is as if I'm making an actual API call. So one thing I actually forgot to mention here, in addition to the provider name, you can define other stuff like the host name. Sorry. Port and host name. So here you can define port. You can define host name. I'm not sure if this is part of JUnit 5, but you can definitely define your host name in the method in case you want to test something other than your local host. But you are limited to a few things. Let me show you what you are limited for. Okay, so you can define your host name. It can either be localhost or 127 or 00 or host name. So these are the only valid host names that you can use. So going back to our test now. So I'm gonna just leave the default, whatever is default. I'm not gonna change it. This is why you're not seeing me here setting a host name. So I'm gonna debug this and run it. First of all, I'm gonna actually delete this. Them, and I was actually starting to test with this, but let me remove it. So here you can see we have one pact and we have one test to verify this pact I generated. Something you need to pay attention for is the pact method. This is part of pact test for and JUnit 5. You don't really have to define it. In case you're going to be working with JUnit 4, you might see something called packet fragment. I prefer to keep it like this because I think it's neat and it keeps things separated, so I know what pact I'm actually testing for. So if the names here, if you decide to go for pact method and your names are not the same, this will probably throw an exception. And let's do this and I'll show you. So I'll run my test here. So as you can see, I deleted my, I can actually delete this folder as well, and it should generate it for me. This will test now. Okay, but of course it failed because it cannot find the directory. So I'm gonna set this back to what it was. Let's do something. I'm gonna do a clean build. Oh, it's failing too. Let me see here. Run my test again. Still failing. Sometimes it behaves. Excuse me. I'm gonna remove everything here. I was testing before I started this. I'm sorry, guys. So run again. Okay, so here you can see. Actually, that generated the old one. I don't want this because my so the naming convention that will be. So it's acting up right now.
Hey, Jawad, are you able to? We have a question says, are you using IntelliJ IDE? Oh, yes. And we've got
Yes.
three.
Yes. I'm sorry. I cannot really see the because I'm in full screen mode.
Oh, no, it's okay. I'll help you. But
yeah. So yes, I am using IntelliJ. This is IntelliJ. It should be work with any IDE basically if you're using Eclipse. This should work also with Maven and Gradle. I personally use Gradle. So So this should work. Sometimes it acts up. So I'm gonna go back to one of my. It should be the same. Do this. Okay. Sure. Okay, let me, so my last thing to do is validating and restarting. This does this sometimes. I'm sorry, guys. So as you can see, we didn't change anything. It was just cached or something. So I'm gonna put a debug point here to show you what we are getting back from the request body here. So here, if you are testing with the request body, of course, it's gonna be request body. If it's just a get, you will use HTTP request only. So we can actually do a test with the get endpoint. But for the purpose of this demo, I actually wanted to make sure I have at least one endpoint that is currently working. So let's continue with our demo. Okay, so I'm gonna debug this and we will see what this is actually returning. So as I said before, this will basically come and read this according to the endpoint you have. And it's a mock server, and it will know which event or pact you are testing for from the. So if we go back now to our pact, it's generated again. This is the path I have. This is the description, and what I care about is the state. So you can see here, that's how Pact will fetch this for you according to the state. This is in the provider case. In the case of the client, it'll be according to the name here. So let's see the debug. So this is my object basically. If we go back to the contract, you are telling it the body return will say something like success and status code 200. And you can see here, this is what your JSON object looks like. It has two fields, message and success. And then the rest is just JUnit. I'm asserting that my status is 200 and my return message is actually success. Now that's basically generating the contract. Now that's on the consumer side. The next step would be for the provider. So let's say you are the one who's writing the API to actually serve the consumer. So in this case, you will be using something called Pact provider. And here you can see the dependencies. I already added them for you guys. This is the consumer in case you want to use it. This is the latest version. And this is the provider dependency. I'm going to go back to my Pact. Now here, as you can see, since this is Spring, I used mock MVC. Some of you should be familiar with this in case you use Spring to test your endpoints. So that's the same. I again defined here my folder where I will be reading my Pact from. So it'll come and check this. The provider as well, who's the provider for me for this class. Now things you need to add here, as you can see, I have a test that is completely empty. The reason I have this empty is because in the case of provider, this will actually go without even running the class. Take my instance here. I don't think I define it in this case. There is a other method where you actually define. So I will show you this method. So this is the consumer. When you go to JVM, this is a consumer. The provider, this is the provider for JUnit. There's multiple ways to actually write a contract verification test. I personally am using, let me see here. So here you can define actually your controller if you want, but I just simply use mock MVC. It makes your life easier. And the test to verify a certain state is from the actual given name that we added before. So going back here, you will add these to your test template, and this is basically extending the Pact invocation context provider, which will basically allow us to verify against the actual endpoint. So here, you guys, in the case of provider, this will actually run and call my controller. Here, I did not define which controller it needs because what I'm using here will just use mock MVC and get the add user endpoint, which already returns success and HTTP 200. So the provider will run against your actual controller. And by the way, consumer and provider does not have to be in the same project. There's multiple ways to generate a contract. You can either publish your contract to Pact website. There's using something called Packet Broker, where you will add the link to your Pact account in addition to an authentication token. And you can publish this to the website. Or in our case, this is the free way of doing it, just by generating a contract. Now, there is a Gradle task that can basically publish your contract. So let's say you are the provider, but you have your own project. So what you can do is the consumer can basically write a task that will publish this to your GitHub repo every time they run it. So for here, I don't have it now because I'm in the same project. So I just needed to define the Pact folder. And of course, if you change the directory here, you need to define which Pact folder you're reading from. You can either define it here or in the Gradle again. So now here, I'm gonna just run this. All I needed is the state and which state, and I don't have to add anything to my test. There's multiple ways to writing a verification test. In AWS, I can show you, for example, my own project. So here you can see I have multiple pacts generated according to the providers and consumers. I have the same consumer, but multiple providers. So in my pact test, I have the consumer test for every endpoint I have. For the verification, I'm using AWS. So instead of using something like mock server in case of Spring Boot, I can still here use mock server, but it's a different instance. I just named it mock server. Let me check which one. So here, you see this in case of AWS, I use something called client and server to create a mock server. But in Spring Boot, it's a lot easier. It actually comes with a mock MVC, so you don't have to do anything. So now I'm gonna just run and show you the result in the log. Who would like to see me writing a pact again, maybe with a different endpoint name, or I actually have in my demo controller. So actually, let's make our provider fail by introducing a new pact to the client. Would you guys like to see this? We still have 7 minutes, I believe. Are we short on time, Jacob? Or we're good?
We are good, but yes, we are scheduled until 5:30. So, but we can hang around.
6:30.
Or yes, 6:30. Sorry.
Yeah, so let's actually do this. So I'm gonna copy this and write a new. So I already have an endpoint here in my demo that returns a list of users. So maybe we can test this. So first of all, this will be actually was for add users. So I'm gonna rename it to for list user success. And here will be list users. user. Here, this has to be similar to what you are expecting your provider to provide you with. So the endpoint name, since I already have it, I'm just gonna name it the same way. It's users. And in this case, it's a get. So I'm expecting it to get mapping here. By the way, you know, as a consumer, you will not have the controller. So I'm just looking just to have an idea of what I'm expecting from my provider to give me. So I'm gonna name it get. It has headers, yes. Does it take a body? No, because it's a get. And what it will respond with is, so if we go back here, my response will be, response object will have 200 value, success, and list. So I will do the same thing here. Have a message, success, and it will have dot minimum array like. So there's multiple ways to writing arrays. Minimum array like is basically guaranteeing that at least one item in an array you're looking for is there for you. There is other stuff. So in case you want to see what the body can look like, you can search Pact DSL JSON body. This is also part of the documentation. Here they will show you how you can generate. So if you, let's say you have a string with a value, you have a number with a value, only string type, this will match any string. So if you, let's say you just want a name, so you can define this. So here, if we scroll down, this will ensure that each item in the list matches the provided example, and the list is no smaller than the provided name, provided minimum. So I think I have the wrong version. This is part of V4. I think I have V3. This is why I think the right way to use this is use unordered array. It'll just ensure that the list matches provided example, ignoring the order. But this here will, if you have more than one item in the array, it will test against all the items to ensure that they have what you expect. But anyway, I think I'm gonna just write one. So minimum array like now here, it's not a big deal. So going back to my controller, if I go to my response object, this is also something I wrote, is just a simple Java object, and the expected field name for the list is data. So I'm gonna use data here, and here you can set the minimum to 1, and here you can put object and dot name or string value, string type. So here I am, my list has basically, this is a dummy payload. It has just a first name and last name. So I'm expecting my list to have 2 fields, one called first name, and the other one is called last name. String type, last name. And then you close your object and you close the array. I'm not sure why this is, let me see. It does not want to be first, yeah. So, okay, so this will basically, okay, so now we can run the test. So I'm gonna take this again. Here, now what we are testing for is Pact for list user success. So I'm gonna copy this and add it to my Pact method name. And here, sorry, this is not user Pact. For now, this is list users. Again, the endpoint that I'm calling now is different. It's according to this, is just users. So I'm gonna put users, and here it's not with body anymore. It's just HTTP request. So, and it's a get. So we're gonna get this. Do I have headers? Yes, I do have headers, and I don't need a body. Now this is same thing. Rename this. Okay, so assert equal here as well. So I also I define here, I just expecting one item at least, right? But you can define as many as you want. And you can basically, so the reason I do this, you can basically get rid of all of this, by the way, and just use like JSON.toJSON, like dummy payload. And this should be enough, but this will be like, this will not be useful to you because if your API is dynamic, so if your list values is changing, this will basically only work in case your body is always returning the same value. So let's say you have an endpoint that returns the same thing every way, you can use this way. But if not, then you would have to use the Pact JSON body like I'm using here. Okay, so I'm gonna assert the size now of my object here. Dot get its JSON array of data dot get size here. Let me see here. I'm not sure if I can get size on this one. The length. Okay. So I'm expecting here, since I told my test that I want just one. So when this will work, it'll generate only one item with like random values in my contract, and hopefully this will run as it is, so we can see what the contract will have. Okay. So it failed on this. Let's see what it says. Unsupported. Okay, let's see. Oh, I don't need the object. So in some cases, like if we go down here, you will need dot object if array containing. Okay, as you can see, my test passed. If I go back to forward altimetric, now in the past you saw there was only one interaction. Now we should have two here. Let me see why I'm not seeing it. So that's add user. It should see a list user. Okay. Let me see, maybe that's. Okay. Okay, now I'm sorry, like setting it to true did not generate it for me. But anyway, so as you saw before, there was one state, which is add user, and it was only for add user. Now you can see your Pact contract has a get method here and the users. And here you can see the data. It just gave it a random value. So if you want to give a defined value, so let's say you are returning a message success in this case, you can do like what I did over here to generate it by using string value instead. And as I said, you can refer to the documentation that I just showed you. So that's pretty much it. We're like 5 minutes over. I'm not gonna write the provider test for this, but I believe you have a better understanding. I hope this was useful for you guys. So feel free to ask any questions if you have some. Again, I'll be uploading this to GitHub in case you guys want to play with code and write your own. Other than that, thank you guys for attending. Thank you, Ryan and Jacob, for hosting this event. I really appreciate it. Feel free to reach out, guys. If you have any questions, I would love to help you. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.